Good morning, everyone. Welcome along. Special welcome to Jeff Stevenson down here. He and the other entertainers have been released from isolation at last. So, they've been given the all clear, and the rumours that they had turned into zombies and were roaming the lower decks of the ship looking for victims, obviously false. And I probably shouldn't have started those rumours. But Jeff was telling us last night that he'd used his time constructively. He had been writing some new material. He's actually invented a new drink called the Frustration Quarantini. It's already been shortened to the FQ, and you'd be happy to know, Jeff, that the skipper has been promoting your new drink. He was shouting FQ, FQ to the officials down on the wharf last night. With his accent, it sounded a little bit different, but he was promoting your drink. So we're going to have a little bit of fun today with ghost ships. But Lee and I had a bit of a laugh the other day. Remember I told you about how we had renamed our boat the Sunshine Coast? Well, someone came up afterwards and said, isn't it bad luck to rename a boat? And we had a bit of a laugh about that because this has come up before. And the story was, just briefly, when we retired early, Lee was very, very nervous about the fact that we were going to buy a boat and cruise around Europe. And at the last minute, the day before we were going to hand in our letters of resignation, she got cold feet. And she said to me, I love the idea of cruising around Europe on our own boat, but I really love living on the Sunshine Coast. So I said to her, no problem, what we'll do is we'll rename the boat Sunshine Coast so you can have the best of both worlds. So that's what we did. But we were telling that story to a friend of ours a few weeks later, and he said, isn't it bad luck to change the name of a boat? And I thought, oh no. I mean, Lee was already stressed out to the nth degree. The last thing she needed was something else to worry about. She's not superstitious at all, but I knew that this would play on her mind. And sure enough, over the next couple of days, she asked me 2 or 3 times, is it bad luck to change the name of a boat? And each time I would say something, sorry, does anyone know what that strange light is up there? Do something to distract her, just like that. She knew that was coming, and she looked away. But I knew that I'd have to face up to this and come up with an answer for her. And sure enough, a couple of days later, she said, isn't it bad luck to change the name of a boat? And I said, yes it is. It's not just bad luck, it's very, very bad luck, unless you do it properly. And to do it properly, you have to have a renaming ceremony, an official ceremony, where you, Lee, as the senior female in the crew, would stand on the foredeck with a bottle of champagne, not just any bottle of champagne, but a very good bottle of champagne. And you would say the words, I hereby rename this vessel Sunshine Coast. You'd pour some into the ocean as King Neptune. You'd pour some on the anchor as a tribute to whoever the gods of occupational health and safety are. And then you drink the rest. And she said, you drink it, you don't smash it against the pointy end. And I said, the bow. I was still trying to teach her the boat jargon at that stage. And I said, no, you don't smash it against the bow. That's for when you launch a new boat or ship. For a renaming of a ship, you drink the champagne. And she thought about that for all of a microsecond, and she said, well, I'm good to go. And she would now rename the boat every other week if I let her. And just to prove it, this is the actual renaming ceremony we had at Hythe Marina near Southampton. We were very lucky that the King Neptune and the gods of occupational health and safety weren't all that thirsty that day. And for the sake of decorum, I'm not going to show you a video of my wife guzzling half a bottle of champagne and having bubbles come out her nose, but believe me, it did happen. But we're going to be talking about ghost ships today and having a little bit of fun as we go along and do that. And of course, the most famous ghost ship in history is the Flying Dutchman. Now, I joined the Navy when I was 15 years old, and I have to tell you that the old salts around at that time liked nothing better than to try and scare the new sailors with scary stories. Well, actually, that's not quite true. They did like good beer and bad women a lot better, but they really did enjoy trying to scare the new recruits. And they used to tell us lots of stories, terrifying stories. And the one that's always stuck in my mind is the story of an Australian destroyer during World War II. And it was part of an escort flotilla, escorting a large convoy of ships from India down through the Indian Ocean to Fremantle. Now, as this convoy was coming through the Indian Ocean, it was on very, very strict blackout conditions. There was be no lights showing at night time whatsoever. It was also on very strict radio silence conditions. You weren't allowed to use any radio at all, just in case the Japanese were able to find the location of this convoy and send submarines to sink some of these ships. And then one night, as they were cruising along, there were only a few nights, it was twilight, so darkness was about to fall. They were cruising, they were only a few days out of Fremantle. All of a sudden, on the horizon, there was a strange glow in the sky. No one had ever seen anything like this before. So using semaphore, the flotilla commander ordered the destroyer, the Australian destroyer, to go off to the west to investigate what this strange light was. And the destroyer turned off to starboard and headed out in that direction. And as it passed over the horizon, it was the last time anybody ever saw this ship and its crew ever again. I mean, that was pretty scary. And as I said, the ships were on strict radio silence, so everyone in the radio rooms aboard the ships in this convoy were very surprised, shocked in fact, when 2 hours later they heard a burst of Morse code coming through their headsets. And 3 operators on different ships throughout the convoy recognised the hand or the style of the operator from the destroyer. Even people ashore in Western Australia heard this signal. So it was a breach of radio silence, which is something you just didn't do. The signal was also sent in the clear. It hadn't been encrypted, which is also a breach of security. You just didn't do that at all as well. When the message was received, it contained only 2 words: Flying Dutchman. Now, that still sends chills up my spine today. If I had any hair on the back of my neck, it would stand up, the sound of that. But so years later, I thought I had to investigate this and find out more about this story, about this destroyer. I mean, what was the name of the destroyer? Who were the crew on board? What were their stories? You know, what had happened to their families and things? So this is before the days of internet and emails and things. So I wrote a letter and I put it in what was called an envelope. Some of you may have heard of them. Oh, actually, what am I kidding? Bloody use quills. I sent that off to Navy office in Canberra. And a few weeks later, I received a reply. And it was from a young lieutenant. And the first paragraph was, he was talking about how happy he was to have received this letter because he had heard this same story when he was a new recruit to the Navy. And he was happy to try and investigate this and find out more. But as the letter read on, it went to say, not sure whether this is good news or bad news, but he's checked it out, and every Australian ship in action during the Second World War had been accounted for. This had never happened. It was just a myth. And it was one of the many, many myths associated with the Flying Dutchman. And the myth started back in 1640 or 1650, and it's all about the skipper of a Dutch man of war belonging to the Dutch East India Company. And his name was Hendrik van der Decken. He was a very arrogant man, very tough sailor, been at sea all of his life. And he was part of a convoy that was going to be heading across the Indian Ocean to the Dutch settlement at Batavia in present-day Java. And as they left Cape Town, a huge storm hit them. And most of the fleet turned around and headed back towards Cape Town, to the safety of Cape Town. But the captain next door to the ship next to Van der Decken yelled through a loud hailer, "Are you going to come back? Are you going to return with us? The storm's too great." And Van der Decken, using a loud hailer himself, yelled back, "May I be eternally damned if I do, though I should beat about here till the day of judgment." And he and his men and his ship were eternally damned. and they now have to sail around the oceans of the world, unable to put into port, unable to go ashore. Sound familiar? And they must cruise the oceans of the world while the skipper stands by the wheel, counting off the centuries with an hourglass. So this is the legend. And if the legend also goes on to say that if you come into contact with the Flying Dutchman, it's a precursor to disaster for you and your ship. It's said that the crew will try and pass you letters or messages addressed to relatives that have been dead for centuries, but that's not known to the crew. And as I said, if you see the Flying Dutchman or come into contact with it, it'll mean bad luck for you and your ship. So just making sure no one has been in contact. Now there's been some, I know this is a myth, and we all know it's a myth, but there's been some very credible sightings of the Flying Dutchman. Now in 1881, Prince Albert Victor, who was second in line to the royal throne, and Prince George, who was third in line to the royal throne, were on a mission, on an expedition around the world, a 3-year voyage around the world to show themselves, to go to all the countries around the world, especially the Commonwealth countries, and show themselves to the people of the Commonwealth. It was just a showing the flag, goodwill type of thing. And they were on the ship HMS Buchanty, and it was sailing across the Indian Ocean from South Africa towards Western Australia. And one night, while Prince Albert Victor was on watch, he was the officer of the watch, a notation was made in the ship's log, the official log, and it said, during the middle watch, the Flying Dutchman crossed our bows. She appeared as a strange red light, as of a ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the mast, spars and sails stood out in strong relief. Now, 14 men aboard the HMS Buchanty swear that they saw this ship. Well, actually 13 did, because the 14th, the lookout that had first seen the ship, the first person to see the Flying Dutchman, he fell from his lookout, from his crow's nest, the day after to his death on the deck of the Buchanty. Now this is all in the official logbooks, and you can go and look it up, the Admiralty records of this voyage, and it's all there in those logbooks, and it's also in the official version, the Admiralty publication of the cruise of HMS Buchanty in 1881. So pretty credible sighting. Prince Albert Victor, he got back to London and he became one of the prime suspects in the Jack the Ripper murders, and he died under unusual circumstances which have never really fully been explained as well. And Prince George, and have a look at this photo of Prince George. Doesn't he look similar to a young William? Well, he went on to become King George V. Now, there's been some other creditable sightings as well. Admiral Karl Donitz, who was the commander of all U-boat forces during World War II, he wrote in his war diary in 1943, and once again, it's available for anyone to go and have a look at. He said that some of his U-boat crews had come across the Flying Dutchman in the waters east of Suez, so the Indian Ocean. And he went on to say in that diary that these crews would rather face the might of the Allied navies in the Atlantic than come across this phantom ship again. And in 1939, 100 people on the beach at Glencairn Beach near Cape Town, some of them very reputable people, reported seeing the Flying Dutchman under full sail come hurtling towards the beach, only to disappear at the last second before it would hit the beach. And it said that the lighthouse keepers along the Cape of Good Hope, all around that cape, often see the Flying Dutchman during storms. But there's a pact between these lighthouse keepers to ward off bad luck for them and their families. They never speak about this in public. It's only amongst themselves that they ever talk about the Flying Dutchman. Is an announcement? So we'll keep going. I think. Yeah, we'll keep going. So we've had a little bit of bad luck on this voyage so far, so it's confession time. Has anybody seen the Flying Dutchman as we've come across the Indian Ocean? Okay. The next story I want to tell you about is about the Lady Lovibond, which is a story of romance, jealousy and murder. And it all starts on the 12th of February 1748. On that day, the captain of the Lady Lovibond, which was a beautiful three-masted schooner, was to marry the love of his life, the beautiful Agneta. It was a lovely ceremony attended by family and members of the crew, and during that ceremony the captain announced that his new bride would be accompanying them on the voyage starting the next day. They were going to go to Oporto in Portugal from London, and this was going to be the start of a honeymoon. Now there were some people aboard the Lady Lovibond that weren't all that happy about this, because these were the days when seamen were very, very superstitious, and people thought that having women on board a ship was bad luck, which is obviously, crazy. Gentlemen, we love having the ladies on board, don't we? A little bit more enthusiasm, yeah. Good on you. So, obviously it's not bad luck to have women on board, or is it? Because it's been a fun trip, hasn't it? I remember a couple of days ago when Lee caught me coming back from the buffet with an extra dessert. I didn't put that down to the fact that I was weak and couldn't control my own diet. I put it down to bad luck that she'd come back to the table just at the same time. And obviously if there was no women on board, she wouldn't have caught me. And I wouldn't have had to put up with 3 days of nagging. Positive reinforcement about my diet. But the man that was really unhappy about Agneta being on this voyage was the first mate, a man by the name of John Rivers. As I said, he was the first mate of the Lady Lovibond. He was the best friend of Simon Peel, the skipper of the Lady Lovibond, and he was also the best man at the wedding between Simon Peel, I said Rivers before, Simon Peel and Agneta. And he was jealous because he was also madly in love with Agneta. And he had a furious jealousy about this marriage, which came to a head that evening when he heard the young couple making love in the cabin next door to his. And he went ashore in London, he visited several taverns, he got drunk, and he was overheard by several people saying that if he couldn't have Agneta, then no one else would. So they set sail the following day on the 13th of February, the day before Valentine's Day, and they were going out through the Thames, out into the Thames estuary, and they'd be passing by what's known as the Goodwin Sands, which is a place that's treacherous. This is probably the third time I've done this presentation, but the very first time that I did it, I was on the very first cruise that we did, and before we picked up our boat. And I explained that we were picking up our boat in Southampton, we'd be cruising through the Goodwin Sands on our way to London, and Lee was petrified. This was the first time that she'd heard about this. She was worried about the English Channel for a start, but now she was going through the Goodwin Sands as well. And this area is famous for the fact that there's been over 2,000 shipwrecks over the years in this region. The Goodwin Sands are very shallow sandbanks and rocky outcrops just beneath the surface of the ocean, and it's very, very hard to spot. So Lee was terrified about going through there, and it wasn't until afterwards that we got through that I told her we'd just been through. And we had an experience when we crossed over from Ramsgate to Dunkirk. We were cruising along, it was early in the morning, we were going at about 26 knots because we wanted to get there as quickly as possible. And on the chart plotter that we had, a red blotch appeared indicating that there was danger ahead. And I looked ahead and there was nothing, it was just flat water ahead. But I slowed down and I went around this red blotch, and as you got closer you could see that just below the surface, about 3 or 4 inches below the surface, there was a sandbank with rocks on this sandbank. So if we had gone screaming along there, it would have been disaster for us. And obviously back in these days, they didn't have chart plotters, so it was a very, very dangerous area. But they left on that 13th of February. They were cruising out into the Goodwin Sands. There was a party on board. People were still celebrating the wedding. There was lots of music and dancing and laughter. But one man wasn't happy, and that was Rivers. And during the festivities, he snuck up behind the helmsman, hit him over the head, disabling him, and now he had control of the helm. And he had the Lady Lovibond at his mercy, and he showed absolutely no mercy. He ran the Lady Lovibond onto the shoals of the Goodwin Sands, and the ship and every soul on board was lost. Or was it? Because 50 years later, to exactly the same date, the ship, the Edenbridge, captained by a man by the name of James Smallwood, was cruising through that area. And he said in his official logbook, which is a legal document, he wrote in there that a ship, a three-masted ship, had cut across his bow. And he'd come so close that he could hear music and laughter coming from the ship, but he couldn't see anybody on the deck of the ship. Now, close by was a fishing trawler, and they reported virtually the same sort of thing. Now, both of these ships, the Edenbridge and the fishing trawler, went to different ports along that Kent coast, and they informed the authorities what had happened. 2 lifeboats were sent out to search for survivors and for wreckage, but they found absolutely nothing. There was no debris there whatsoever. It was just a complete mystery. There was no reports of any missing shipping at that time. And then 50 years later, exactly to the same day again, witnesses are having a picnic on the cliffs overlooking the channel, reported seeing a 3-masted vessel heading straight for the Goodwin Sands and breaking up on those sands. They rushed down to the local lifeboat station. They informed them what had happened. Once again, a lifeboat went out to investigate, and once again, nothing was ever found of that in that location. 50 years, exactly again to the day, another party, a church group, were having a picnic. It was a beautiful sunny day. They were having a picnic atop the cliffs there again, and almost the same thing happened. They reported seeing a 3-masted vessel heading straight for the sands. The pastor himself raced down to the coast, to the lifeboat station, and informed them once again. The same thing happened. Nothing was ever found. There was no reports of missing shipping at that time. And then 50 years ago, 50 years again to the day, in 1948. So this is getting fairly recent. Another ship, skippered by Captain Bull Prestwick, an American, reported seeing an ancient 3-masted ship in pristine condition pass by his ship very close by. Now he got on the radio. He saw that it was heading straight to the Goodwin Sands as well. He got on the radio. He reported it. He stayed in the area until the lifeboat came out, and together they searched the area but couldn't find any survivors or any debris at all. Now, people had had a gutful by now, and Scotland Yard detectives, experienced detectives from Scotland Yard, came down and they questioned Captain Prestwick. It turned out that he was an American commander of an American warship during World War II. He had been decorated for his service. He was very well respected. He had no disciplinary problems whatsoever. The detectives found that he'd served all his time in the Pacific. He knew nothing about the legend of the Lady Lovibond, and they later issued a statement that they believed everything that Captain Prestwick had said. 50 years later, to the day, the local council in Kent decided that they would try and promote this, to try and get people to come down to the coast to spend that Valentine's weekend on the coast. And local businesses, chambers of commerce and hotels and pubs and B&B places were very happy that they did so, because thousands of people came down for that weekend to see whether they could see the Lady Lovibond for themselves. Now, the council copped a bit of stick. Politicians, and you can read about this as well, stood up in the House of Parliament, and they criticised the council for taking advantage of a tragedy that had happened 250 years before. They said that the council were acting irresponsibly and they should show more integrity, which is a great thing coming from a politician anyway, which are the benchmarks of integrity, aren't they? So But unfortunately that weekend, nothing was seen. The weather had come in. There was lots of drizzle, there was lots of cloud. You could only see for a couple of hundred metres, so no one could see out into the channel. So no one actually saw whether the Lady Lovibond came on that day or not. So maybe it did, maybe it didn't, maybe at last the ship and all the souls on board are at peace, but perhaps not. But we're going to find out for sure, because in 2048 it's all aboard the Sunshine Coast. You can go up to the Future Cruise office if you like, and you can book a cruise on the Lee and I... No? Oh, the boss is saying that's not going to happen. Okay, I was going to say that there was 4 seats available, but now there might be 5. This is what you know as, this is what you call a mutiny, ladies and gentlemen. I haven't got the regulations of maritime law with me at the moment, but I'm pretty sure that the penalty for mutiny is be put over the knee for a good spanking. She doesn't like the spanking. She always says that her hand gets tired after a while. But anyway, that's the legend of the Lady Lovibond. The next one is about a much more modern ghost ship. And I heard about this by watching CNN and other cable news network programs. This has happened in February 2016. And it was all over the internet. And the headlines were all about ghost ship found, which was, got my attention straight away. I thought, what's this all about? And it turns out that the reports from CNN were that Indonesian fishermen near Barabo in the Philippines, Filipino fishermen near Barabo in the Philippines had come across a yacht. And on that, it was obviously disheveled, it was obviously in a bad appearance, and they came across that yacht, they hailed the yacht, and they couldn't get an answer, so they boarded the vessel. And down below, they found the body of the owner of the vessel, Manfred Borjat. Now, I'm going to put up a photo in a second of the way Manfred was actually discovered. It's a true photo of Manfred. He was discovered in a petrified or a mummified state. He hadn't decomposed at all. So if you don't want to see this photo, it's fairly graphic. If you don't want to see it, look away, and I'll tell you when it's safe to look back again. So if you don't want to see it, look away now. No one. So that's the way he was found. He was found below decks in a mummified state. And yeah, that was all the reports were saying. I'll put something nicer up. The report said that he was found with a terrified look on his face, and it looked like he was reaching for the radio. Now, the reports also said that he had bought his yacht 20 years previously, and he'd been cruising around the oceans of the world for 20 years. But the report said that no one had seen or heard of Manfred or his vessel for 11 years prior to this. The last time they'd heard of him was when he was cruising off the coast of South Africa in the Indian Ocean 11 years previously. So what had happened? We know we've learnt something else that cruises around the Indian Ocean today, haven't we? So the Flying Dutchman. Perhaps Manfred had come into contact with the Flying Dutchman 11 years before. Maybe they tried to pass him a message, and he had rushed down below, terrified, with a terrified expression on his face, trying to grab hold of the radio. And the horror of what he had seen had overcome him, and he had been killed by this curse. And that he had stayed. The curse had made him stay in a mummified composition rather than decomposing over those 11 years. And perhaps the Sayo had roamed the oceans of the world for that 11 years with no one at the helm. Cruise ships passing by this small yacht, people playing deck quoits and shuffleboard up on the decks, looking out over this vessel and seeing no one at the helm. Perhaps that is what had happened to Manfred and his vessel. Well, no. What wasn't reported and wasn't retracted on CNN and the other news services was that when the autopsy was done, and the inquest was carried out, it was said that Manfred had updated his Facebook account 1 week before he died, and then he'd had a massive heart attack and gone down to his cabin and died down there. And the fact that he was in a mummified state was the fact that he was in a hot, humid environment near the Philippines, which was a constant sort of heat and humidity through there, which causes mummification, and that the salt air had also impacted on that mummification, and the fact that there was no insects on the boat while it was at sea meant that there was nothing to break down the body and decompose the body. So that's what happened to Paul Manfred. So that's one mystery that we've solved for today. But now we're coming to the big one, because we're going to work together now and we're going to try and solve the mystery, one of the oldest mysteries of all time. What caused the curse of the Mary Celeste? You ready? So we'll get into this. I'll tell you a little about the history of the Mary Celeste and what happened to her. She was built in Canada in 1861. She was originally named the Amazon. And from the very start, she looked like she had a curse on her. On her maiden voyage, just 2 days out of port, her captain suddenly died of a strange disease. And the ship turned around and went back to port. They got another captain on board, and he sailed off towards London. Off the coast of Maine, the ship struck a large fishing equipment and destroyed that equipment. When he went to London, he was coming out through the Thames estuary, and he hit an English brig and sunk that brig, causing deaths of some of the sailors aboard that brig. Then in 1867, it hit a reef and it was written off as a wreck. Eventually, an American decided to buy the salvage rights to the wreck, and he put money after money into this ship. In fact, he spent almost $9,000 at the time, which was a fortune. It was enough to buy a brand new ship at that time, trying to bring this ship back into its original condition. Every time he spent money, they wanted more money to do something else, and I can relate to that because I can tell you that the acronym for BOAT actually stands for bring out another 1,000. So he spent so much money on this ship, restoring this ship, that he went bankrupt, and his creditors sold the ship out from under him. And it was eventually purchased in 1871 by a consortium headed by Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs. And they wanted to give this ship a new lease of life. So they renamed it the Mary Celeste. Now, Captain Briggs was a man with a very good reputation as a seaman, a very competent man, a very well-respected seaman. He was a God-fearing man. He married his cousin Sarah, and they had 2 children, Arthur, who was 9 years old, and Sophia Matilda, who was 2 years old. And they'd spent some money doing a restructure to the ship, and Captain Briggs himself was going to take this vessel with his family on its first voyage across to Europe. Now, as I said, he was a God-fearing man. No one questioned the fact his ability, no one questioned his discipline, no one questioned his integrity at all. He and his wife often boasted about the fact that they abstained from all alcohol. They said that never a drop of alcohol had ever passed their lips in all their lives. So they were straight shooters, straight down the line sort of people. And so were his crew. He took 7 crew along on this journey, and once again, they were all well-respected seamen with lots and lots of experience. And this is the official manifest of the Mary Celeste before it left New York. It was going to be carrying a cargo to Genoa in Italy, and that cargo was going to be distilled alcohol, a lot of distilled alcohol held in the holds. And it left New York on the 7th of November, 1872, just as a normal sort of voyage. No one thought anything more of this, with Captain Briggs in command. And this was the journey, this was the way they were going to take. It was just a standard sort of thing across from New York to Genoa, as I said, in Italy. Now, 8 days after the Mary Celeste left, another brigantine, American brigantine by the name of de Gracia, with a Captain Morehouse on board commanding it, left New York as well on a very similar sort of course. And then on the 4th of December 1872, the lookout on board the de Gracia called Captain Morehouse to the deck. He had seen a ship in the distance about 6 miles away. Its sails set erratically and the steering of the ship was very erratic. So Morehouse decided to come alongside, and he came alongside and he hailed the Mary Celeste, but no one answered. So he dispatched his first mate and another man in the longboat to go across to Mary Celeste to investigate. When those two men got on board, they found that the Mary Celeste was deserted. No one on board whatsoever. They went through and checked everything as best they could. They found out that the ship's company had obviously left in a hurry. There was still uneaten food on the tables that had rotted, so it had been several days since they had left. There was all the crew's possessions were in order. There was some beds that were unmade, but that was the only thing that was out of place. They went down into the hold and found that the cargo was in perfect condition. There was no issues there. There was a little bit of water, about 3 inches of water in the hold, but this wasn't unusual for a ship like that at its time. They went into the captain's cabin and there was nothing amiss there, but underneath the captain's bunk, they found a sword, and it had some brown colouring on the blade of the sword, and they thought this might be dried blood. Could this be a clue as to what had happened? But it was later found that it was rust, not dried blood. They noticed that the ship's yawl or longboat had been lowered and was no longer there. It was no longer on the ship, and that there was a rope trailing behind the Mary Celeste, and when they hauled that rope in, they found that the end of it was all frayed. So they didn't really know what was happening. But Captain Morehouse decided that he would put a crew on board and he'd sail both vessels to Gibraltar, and he would claim the salvage rights for the Mary Celeste, which was his right to do. When they arrived in Gibraltar, both ships were immediately interned and put basically under arrest, and an inquiry was set up into what had happened. Now, that inquiry was headed by a man by the name of Frederick Solly Flood, who had the reputation of being an absolute buffoon. He was the senior administrator for the island, but wasn't well respected at all. It said that once he had made up his mind about something, once he had given a first impression about something, it didn't matter what sort of evidence or what sort of information or common sense that was presented to him, he wouldn't change that mindset at all. He was stuck on it. And from the very start, he believed that Morehouse and the crew of the de Gracia had something to do with the disappearance of the crew of the Mary Celeste, even though there was absolutely no evidence to suggest this was true. They had left New York 8 days after the Mary Celeste. Even if they wanted to catch up to the ship, they probably wouldn't have been able to. So evidence was presented to this court of inquiry. It went around, and if you read the transcripts, it's obvious that Flood has a bent against Morehouse and his crew. It's very obvious from reading through the lines. But a lot of things were investigated during that inquiry. And some of the theories they came up with, could it have been mutiny? There was a 2-year-old child aboard this vessel, 2-year-old kid, girl. And now, I don't know about you, but if I had to spend months and months in the confined space with a 2-year-old, I'd probably mutiny. But had the crew mutinied and dispatched the captain and his family over the side, well, where was the crew? If that had happened, where was the crew? There was no evidence of anything like that. Surely the crew would still be on board if that had happened. So that was discounted. Piracy was another theory that came up. Now, once again, all the crew's possessions were intact. There was cash on board that was still intact. The cargo was still intact. So piracy was discounted as a cause of what had happened. Could it have been insurance fraud, which was a rampant sort of thing that happened at the time? But the cargo was insured for the normal amount of money, probably even underinsured if anything, and there was no claim for insurance. The cargo on the ship was still intact. Briggs himself would have had to claim the insurance, but he had disappeared. So how could it possibly be insurance fraud? Could it have been some sort of paranormal activity, a whirlpool or something that had sucked them down into some sort of vortex? I mean, that was investigated, seriously investigated, and that was discounted as well. Could it have been sea monsters that have had something to do with it? Oh, sorry, that's my mother-in-law. I don't know how that's happened, sorry. I think what's happened is, you've heard of predictive text. I've been using predictive images, and I've typed in sea monster, and this is what's come up. So sorry about that. No, sea monsters. No, that's still her. No, that's a real sea monster. I'm in so much trouble. But I mean, obviously, that was discounted as well. Could the fumes from the cargo, the distilled alcohol, have overcome the crew? Could they have been disorientated from these fumes from the cargo and decided that they would have to abandon ship? But I mean, the cargo was in perfect condition. There was no evidence of that as well. I mean, all they'd have to do would be open up some hatches if that was the case and let those fumes disperse. So once again, that was discounted. But the crew had left. They'd abandoned ship for some reason. No one knows what that reason was. They'd obviously got into the ship's boat and they'd disappeared. So maybe they got into the ship's boat thinking that they could tie themselves onto that rope that was trailing behind the Mary Celeste. And maybe it was a case of, did you tie the rope on? I thought you did. So maybe it was a bit like that, and they drifted off as the ship sailed off into the distance. But eventually the inquiry found that they had to find that there was an open case. They couldn't just come up with an answer to what had happened. They didn't know. But eventually an amount was given, amount of money was given to the crew of the De Gracia, Morehouse and the crew, based on the salvage rights. But I mean, that amount was about a quarter of what would normally be expected for a salvage of this type, this sort of value. So even that cast aspersions on the crew of the De Gracia. And it wasn't until 9 years later that a US court held a court of inquiry, and finally the crew of the De Gracia were cleared of all wrongdoing in this case. But the ship itself returned to New York in September 1873. Because of its reputation now as a cursed ship, it found it very difficult to find a captain and a crew who wanted to serve on this ship. And they also found it very difficult to attract cargo to be transported on this ship because everyone believed the ship to be cursed. So the owners weren't able to make any profits. So the ship was sold several times along the way. In February 1879, another disaster happened. The captain on board, Captain Tuttle, he suddenly died of an illness. He was in perfectly good health one day and suddenly dead the next day of a strange illness. So this is the third captain to die aboard the Mary Celeste. In November 1884, it was wrecked on a reef off the coast of Haiti. Now, the cargo, it was found, had been insured for an enormous amount of money, a huge amount. And when the insurance company investigated, they found that that cargo was actually worthless. And this was a case of insurance fraud. The owner at the time, a man by the name of Mr. Porter, and two co-conspirators were arrested. They were charged in New York and with the crime of insurance fraud, but also willfully casting away a ship, which was a capital crime at its time. They could have been hung for this offence. But before they could go to court, one of the co-conspirators went crazy. He was consigned to a lunatic asylum for the rest of his life. The other co-conspirator committed suicide. And just before they were able to go to court, the body of Mr. Porter, who had been a very, very rich man at one stage, he was found frozen to death on the streets of New York. He had lost all his money, he was destitute on the streets, he was homeless, and he had died, succumbed to the elements during that time, that winter in New York. So ladies and gentlemen, there you are. You've got all the evidence about what happened to the Mary Celeste, what caused this great curse to befall this ship. So over to you. What do you think caused this? Change of name, exactly. They didn't. Remember I told you that it was originally called the Amazon, and they changed the name to Mary Celeste. and that the captain, Benjamin Spooner Briggs, and his wife Sarah were absolute teetotalers. They boasted that never a drop of alcohol had ever passed their lips. They could not possibly have had a renaming ceremony with a bottle of champagne. They obviously didn't toast King Neptune and the gods of work, occupational health and safety. So this is obviously what's happened. King Neptune has these, and there's a woman on board as well. So King Neptune must have been furious. As this ship was passing over its nice, quiet ocean, he's got a 2-year-old running around making noise on his ocean. He's got a woman on board, and when he's investigated this further, he's found out that this ship didn't even pay tribute, that they didn't pay their respects to him by offering him some of the champagne. So obviously, here's photographic proof now that King Neptune raised up from the depths of the ocean and snatched the crew of the Mary Celeste and took them down to the depths of Davy Jones' locker. So quite obvious, isn't it? So ladies and gentlemen, that's the bit of fun I said we're going to have with Ghost Ships today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll be back in a couple of days' time with a much more serious topic. I'll be telling you all about the very first, the most powerful, the most ruthless, the most profitable company in the history of the world, the Dutch East India Company, and hope to see you then. Thank you.